Hey there berries, welcome to a season 13 support guide. I've done a few of these already. If you are interested in me teaching you how to play support, then I'd highly recommend you subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've already covered like Thresh and Milio and Luck support, and today we're going to be looking at Morgana. If you have any questions about the guide, feel free to leave a comment down below, or feel free to ask me at twitch.tv/Bizzleberry. Okay. So for these guides, it's going to be the same format as always. If you've seen the previous videos, we're going to be doing a one-take 30-minute-ish video covering everything from runes, summoners, items, abilities, ability skill orders, and any tips and tricks. As you can see on screen, we've got an Arcane Comet rune build, and this is the rune build that you're going to be using for every single game that you play League, apart from maybe changing the armor rune to magic resist if you are up against AP. Arcane Comet works nicely in terms of when you land your binding is a guaranteed Arcane Comet hit, and you will be doing decent harassment with that. Mana Flow Band to generate mana, Transcendence for cooldown reduction, Scorch, tiny bit of extra damage during the laning phase, Inspiration, we're going to be taking Biscuits, and Perfect Timing. Probably the only support that on the regular takes Perfect Timing because you need it for your ultimate, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Double Adaptive Force, and that 6 armor rune, which you can flex for magic resistance. Pretty standard Morgana build. There isn't really much of a difference in terms of what other people take. Some people do Glacial Augment, but I don't necessarily recommend that, but that could be a potential valid option if you want to seek that in the future. But for guide purposes, I want you to take this rune build, use it for a few games, and if you want to try out Glacial Augment, go ahead. Next, we're going to be going into the practice tool, and we're going to talk about summoners, and then we're going to be talking about items and the abilities, etc. So I'm going to choose Morgana here. And then for summoners, for Morgana, it's very standard to have Flash Ignite. Flash is absolutely mandatory, and Ignite is generally the thing you want to take because it is the most... You are looking for kills in laning phase with your catch potential with your binding, which we'll go through a little bit later on. Exhaust is a safer option against like hyper carries like Master Yi jungle on the enemy team, but for guide purposes I want you to try and stick with that Ignite and look to get those kills in the bot lane. This build is much more like a mage kind of Morgana build as opposed to an enchanter. Her enchanter role is not particularly good right now, but the mage one will give you the highest chance of winning in your League of Legends games. So the first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to be talking about the items that you can take on Morgana. Definitely start off with the Spell Thieves, and then you're going to want to go into Sork Shoes as soon as you can. Sork Shoes over the cooldown reduction boots. If you're playing a more protective kind of style with your shield on your E, which we'll talk about later, cooldown reduction could end up being better, but on the whole, just generally the raw win rate in terms of AP Morgana is much higher than playing that kind of enchanter build. So I'd highly recommend that you go into Sork Shoes. Sork Shoes gives you magic penetration, and especially in those early parts of the game where people don't have that much magic resistance, magic penetration is really, really good. Basically, the way it works is that magic penetration has more value the lower the enemy magic resist. So magic penetration is going to be really, really good. A lot of squishy champions don't generally pick up magic resistance anyway. And so yeah, damage increase, Sork Shoes plus the movement speed is invaluable. You're going to need that with your ultimate, which we'll talk about that later. Next, the second item on Morgana. Now you have a choice. It is pretty much mandatory that you take these two items, but in what order will determine a lot on the enemy team composition and how comfortable you are at using your ultimate. Now we've got the commencing stopwatch in our inventory, which is going to help us in order to get into the Zhonya's pathing a little bit easier, because we do need a stasis with our ultimate. So Zhonya's first is a really, really good option. It allows you to get into the middle of team fights and do what you need to do. However, going Liandry's first is also a fine option. Liandry's works pretty nicely with Morgana's kit, and is the best in terms of actual damage for Morgana. So you definitely want both of these items. The question is when. Well, if you're up against a lot of high burst targets and you really need to get into the middle of team fights, then Zhonya's is the ideal option that you take first. If you feel like you can play like a ranged poke mage, kind of sort of like a Lux in some way, then go into the Liandry's option. I feel like particularly if you're snowballing as well, if you're winning bot lane quite hard, then going the Liandry's route is usually the best way to go. So you're taking both of these items, and then the third item, because those are two quite expensive items, you're then going to be going into Wardstone. Wardstone is a really, really good item because once you hit level 13, it will convert into the Vigilant Wardstone, which counts as a legendary item, which will go towards the Liandry's, which gives you a little bit more haste. Also, it gives you extra haste on the item itself, ability power, health, and attack damage, but we don't really care about the attack damage. The other thing that this item does is it allows you to put down an extra stealth ward and an extra control ward. That way you'll be able to enhance your team's vision on the map. So also it will hold all your control wards. So if you continue to buy control wards, which you should, they will be automatically stored inside the Vigilant Wardstone, like basically replacing that space. So it doesn't take up any more inventory space. So the general build path is Zhonya's, Liandry's into the Wardstone. Final item here, you can go actually either three of these items. These are probably the only three items that you'll be looking at. If you need anti-heal, picking up the Oblivion Orb is pretty cheap at 800 gold. You're going to be doing damage tags to quite a lot of people anyway. So 40% Grievous Wounds is a really nice option. You could go into the Rylai's, which basically adds slow to your abilities. Once again, that's kind of nice too, just a kind of utility. If you want more raw damage, the Demonic Embrace would be the way to go. So anti-heal priority, otherwise take more utility or more damage if you can somehow accumulate the gold for that last item slot. Next, we're going to be talking about Morgana's abilities. Now, Morgana isn't the most complicated champion to know, but her abilities are more tricky slash gimmicky. So first, let's talk about Morgana's passive. Very basic passive that you don't actually need to worry about. Morgana heals for 18%, well that's at maximum level, of her damage dealt by her abilities to champions and large minions and medium and larger junker monsters. So basically, whenever you do any of your damage abilities, your Q, W or R, you're going to be healing. That works on the Baron, so if you're getting low health, make sure you're whacking your abilities on the Baron or the Dragon in order to heal up on when you're doing those objectives. Next, we're going to be talking about the reason why Morgana is played, and that is her Q, her binding. If you played something similar to Lux, it's incredibly similar to that, but this will only hit one target. The reason why this ability is really good is because when you max it, it goes to a 3-second root duration. Once you get that extra ability haste in, your binding will be on a roughly 6-second cooldown, so you're basically going to have the potential to root a target for about 50% of the time. Very simple point and click, lands it. The base damage on the spell is actually very good. 300 at max rank, 0.9 AP ratio, very generous AP ratio as well. Very strong crowd control, very strong damage. The downside to this ability though, it is a little bit predictable and it can be blocked by minions. So you'll need to be creative in terms of landing those bindings. A lot of the time you're going to be trying to use the brush and different kind of angles in order to try and get those bindings down onto the enemy bot lane. Morgana's next ability is her W, which is a small AoE. The damage per second with 1 point in this ability is actually pretty low. It does more damage, up to 170% of the target's missing health. So the lower HP that the enemy is, the more damage this ability will do. Also, when you heal with your passive, so if you do the W on an enemy champion, or if you use it on like a cannon minion, it will actually start reducing the remaining cooldown on the Tormented Shadow. So it will reduce the cooldown of your W, so you might be able to do 2, 3, 4 of these in a fight, depending on how many different champions you manage to tag with the W. And also it also works with your Q and your ulti. When you're activating your passive, it's going to make your W come off a little bit quicker, so you should be able to get a few of these off in a team fight relatively easily. You can showcase that now. So the classic kind of combo is you land your binding, and then you put your W underneath them, and then you might be able to get to do another W charge as they're kind of walking away as well. As you can see, it lasts on the ground for quite some time. Morgana's third ability, her E, is called Black Shield. Now this is a shield that you can either self-cast with yourself, with like Alt E for example, or you can give it to an allied champion. Now the cooldown on this spell is relatively long, but it is pretty powerful as it does prevent all crowd control affected onto that target for as long as that shield lasts. So for example, if you see a Blitzcrank hook coming through, if you onto your AD carry and you shield your AD carry, not only will it block some of that magic damage coming from the hook, it would mean that your target does not get crowd controlled. Now a tip with this is that Morgana shield works incredibly well against physical champions, because they struggle to pop off the shield because it's a magic damage shield. For as long as that shield is active, they will not be crowd controlled. So against physical damage compositions, this is an incredibly strong ability which can block 2, 3, 4 crowd controls in a fight depending on the enemy team's elemental composition. If you're up against a lot of magic damage on the enemy team, this shield won't last as nearly as long, and it might get popped after one ability. So do factor that in. One tip with the Black Shield is that against like the Blitzcrank, a classic matchup where people take Morgana into, is that if you actually know Blitzcrank is going to engage, if you actually self-cast E and make sure you're standing in front of your AD carry, it limits the targets that Blitzcrank can hook to basically you, and it will guarantee that the hook will get blocked. Huge tip for that. Huge tip. You should be doing that as much as possible. Be more careful against champions like Thresh, for example, because Thresh can still hook onto you. You won't get like yoinked by the hook effect of Thresh, but Thresh will still be able to press Q again and fly on top of you, and then be able to flay your AD carry back. So that's one way where you can accidentally get your AD carry caught out still. In that situation, it's probably best that you back shield your AD carry. Now for Morgana's ultimate, it is probably the most awkward support ultimate in the entire game, and this is why we're taking Zhonya's. So Morgana will, let me get another target dummy to kind of showcase this a little bit better. Morgana will target any champions inside this circle. She will slow them, and if they are unable to walk out of range of Morgana, then they are stunned for 1.5 seconds. Also, Morgana gains movement speed when she is going towards enemies that she has chained. So, this is the ultimate. You can see those chains coming out, and because those targets were unable to move out of their range, they end up getting stunned. If they end up breaking it, so if we move out of the range, then the targets won't get stunned, but they'll still take the initial damage that we did to them, which is an okay base amount of damage. So, as you can imagine, you kind of need to get close to these champions in order to be able to stun them. A classic combo would be just flashing in, ultimating, and then as your tether is like halfway done, you would want to stop Zhonya's earlier than that, but flashing, ulting, Zhonya'ing to prevent any damaging coming through. The chains still work while you're Zhonya'd, and that's a good way to be able to stun the enemy team with taking as little damage as possible, because they literally won't be able to hit you. The downside to obviously Sonya's thing, perhaps even too early, is that it definitely gives them more time to move out of your ultimate and then not get stunned. But that's why this is in particular quite awkward for Morgana. If you are playing back and you don't want to do that kind of engage, you're generally going to be saving your ultimate to help protect the squishier people on your team from assassins. So say for example an assassin is going to be jumping on the target dummy. As they're about to get in range, you're using whatever tools at your disposal to help peel them off and keep them away from your AD carry. Now the absolute basic combo is obviously the Q and the W that we talked about earlier because they are unable to move out the pool. You can also use this as well when particularly early stages of the game when you just hit 6, say if you land your binding, you're going to want to run forward, bind, get your W down as well over your binding or over your ulti, use your ignite and then do what you can after that and hopefully your binding will be coming up off cooldown. Morgana's literally a more hands-on approach. You're definitely in their face. She is some sort of hybrid in between Engager, Mage, and Enchanter with just how her kit is. So she's kind of a little bit of everything. So yeah, this is why you have to have the Zhonya's though. So this is why you need to evaluate whether or not the Zhonya's is going to work for you as a first item or a second item, because you will be needing a stasis at some point in the game in order to go in, because you will just get blown up otherwise. Especially if you're going like Leandri's first, the black shield is not going to be a big enough shield to protect you, because when you're coming in like this, if you have your black shield off cooldown, you're generally going to want to black shield yourself as well so you can't get stunned before you stasis. But it can be an extremely game-changing, dangerous tool that you can use in order to win a game. Basically solo, if you're able to get multiple people caught off in a team fight after you flashing in with a flank. Now the alternate playstyle, as I mentioned, where you just wait for assassins jumping onto your AD carry, you're generally just trying to do max range Qs and Ws. But obviously the enemy team will be able to see that coming, so you have two methods really, two main methods of landing bindings at that kind of range, mid game and onwards, and everyone's already got their boots and things like that. First one is playing flank again, where you're in the fog of war and you're able just to kind of like snipe people off the side. That is a really good way of landing Qs. The second one is waiting for layering. So layering the stuns one after the other. So it could be a root, it could be a slow from a teammate. It could be that your top laner, just engages in. You can be the secondary engage and helping setting up there. So that is the other way that you do it. Ideally, you don't want to be the first person throwing out the binding to initiating a fight. The exception is potentially in the bot lane. But ideally you are playing with an AD carry that can either complement your binding if you are the first one to engage, or have an AD carry that can help set you up. So a couple of nice champions to play with when you're playing Morgana in terms of setup is champions that can slow, such as Ashe or Misfortune. They both have slows, and if the enemy is slowed, it's going to make your time easier landing those bindings. Another really popular combination, and that's probably the most powerful one, is actually the Caitlyn Morgana combo. Now this does rely on you being able to land your bindings first. Caitlyn won't necessarily be able to help you set up for this one, but if you are able to land a binding in lane, Caitlyn will put a cupcake trap underneath your binding, and that gives her a headshot bonus damage. Basically, essentially gives her bonus damage and allows her to set up a lot of her kit on top of that binding. So if you are able to play with champions that can greatly utilize the fact that they are bound to incorporate more crowd control over the top to really pin that hot target down, or you want to play with AD carries that can, as I mentioned, help facilitate for your bindings, like Ashe and Misfortune. In terms of actual gameplay, as I mentioned before, a lot of it could be in terms of flash flanking plays. I think the safer option is playing the more backline mage and working off of that. Your damage once you get to the Zhonya's and Liandry's will actually be extremely high, especially against squishy targets that don't have magic resistance. Any assassins jumping in, they will get bound for 3 seconds. So unless they have a way to remove that, they're going to be in a lot of trouble if you're able to land that. There is one potential item that you will need to be aware of, or two really. So assassins, when playing against a champion like Morgana, like to pick something like Edge of Night, and that gives them a spell shield that blocks the next enemy ability. You've also got the same as well with Banshees, which is the AP equivalent. You probably won't see Banshees as much, but the Edge of Night is a semi-often build. So you need to be aware of that, and that basically gives the target a little blue shimmer circle around the champion, and it will block that binding. And it's going to be really difficult for you to actually pop that off because your W doesn't unfortunately remove the black shield, so you will potentially have to choose between using your ultimate on that one target or your Q if they're already coming in towards your AD carry, in terms of weighing up which one is going to be worth it. Do I need the more immediate crowd control, or are we able to kite this out just a little bit and then get the actual nice value from the ultimate? So you would have to choose, say if you wanted to use the binding, you'd have to use your ultimate first. It will fizzle out, but will break the shield, and then you would then get to use your Q to then whack on to the assassin to root them in place. So that's one minor thing that you might need to potentially pay attention to into some of your League of Legends games. Other than that, the hardest thing really is actually the timing on the shields. We talked about it a little bit earlier, how you can self-cast your E and use that to block like a blitzcrank hook on a vulnerable target. That way you can guarantee that the hook hits yourself rather than your AD carry. It is a lot more tricky to anticipate and get that crowd control blocked when you're shielding it onto your AD carry. It means that you're going to be having to look at 2 places at once a lot of the time in order to make sure that the vulnerable targets don't get crowd controlled. Sometimes reaction time and latency plays a big factor in this sort of thing. Say for example, Ashe ultimate comes through, Ashe arrow. If that lands on a target, that could be a 3-second stun. But if you're able to quickly black shield it as it's coming through, it's going to block and negate that stun. But you're going to have to be very quick on your fingers in order to be able to block that. So do be careful. It's not all just staying back and throwing out Qs. Sometimes you really need to be paying attention to what the potential crowd control threats are. Try and identify those if possible at the start of the game. Things like the Ashe arrow or any kind of like random little stuns. Particularly physical crowd control is really good to make sure you keep an eye out of. Like the Vi ultimate as well, because Vi will basically like launch herself in and then try and knock the target up in the air. But if you've got that black shield on your target, they're not actually going to get put up into the air. They'll still take the physical damage portion because the shield doesn't block physical damage, but it means it will stop that crowd control. And there's a lot of different like little crowd control effects on a lot of champions that you can have a high value on in terms of blocking. But a lot of it's just about anticipation and understanding what you're able to block, which comes with practice, unfortunately. But I think that's about everything that I can cover. Unfortunately, Morgana doesn't have the easiest setup for her binding. Something like Lux that we covered on a guide recently, she has a slow that she can put down to increase your binding. If you're finding it very, very difficult and you're not liking the flash kind of engage play of your ultimate, you could try dropping out of Zhonya's and going into a R'ly's instead of the Zhonya's, which would mean that your W would act like a mini Lux E, slowing down the targets to potentially help you land your bindings on the target. But that is not the ideal playstyle, and I don't necessarily recommend it for the majority of cases. But if you're really wanting to play Morgana and you're really struggling landing your Qs, that could be a good fix in order to potentially help you practice landing those bindings in solo queue. But I think I've covered everything there. I hope you guys enjoyed the support guide. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below or hit me up at twitch.tv/Bizzleberry, where I pretty much stream almost every day. If you're interested in support guide content or even gameplay content, be sure to subscribe. I've got loads of videos on the channel, from coaching sessions to high ELO gameplay to more guides like this, so be sure to check them out, and it should help you climb in League of Legends. All the best, and see you for another video soon. Bye.